Welcome back to Unseen Rite, where forgotten truths claw their way out of the dark, demanding to be heard. Tonight's descent begins in the sweltering heart of 19th century Kentucky, where 43 souls vanished into the soil without a scream, a footprint, or a trace. This is not folklore. It is not fiction. It is a truth that was buried, intentionally, violently, by hands that feared what might happen if it ever surfaced again. In the suffocating heat of July 1876, the Beaumont Plantation stood as a symbol of uneasy prosperity in post-war America. Fields of tobacco stretched endlessly, soaked in the sweat and blood of workers both free and forgotten. But on the morning of July 25th, 43 laborers, men, women, and children, simply ceased to exist. Their cabins untouched, their tools still damp with dew, their meals still steaming on the hearth. The sheriff's report closed after 3 days. No signs of foul play, they said, just a mass exodus in the dead of night. But why would entire families flee, leaving behind wages, clothes, even infants' cribs? Local whispers tell a far darker tale, that the land itself swallowed them, that something unnatural moved through the fields that night, something not born of man or God. For nearly 150 years, the residents of Whitley County have kept their mouths shut and their heads down. But recently, a decaying chest was discovered inside the attic of the long-abandoned Beaumont Manor, sealed beneath iron nails and salt, an old Southern ward against evil. Inside were letters, maps, and a blood-stained journal that tells a story no one was meant to hear. Before we continue with the chilling history of the Beaumont legacy and uncover what really happened to those 43 vanished souls, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark historical mysteries. Tell us in the comments below, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our viewers across America, because what you're about to hear may not only change the way you see Kentucky's past, it may shatter the way you understand reality itself. The Beaumont Plantation wasn't just any southern estate. It was a power hub, a 600-acre sprawl of fertile land perched at the edge of something older than Kentucky itself. Locals called it God's Hollow, a misnomer passed down from Choctaw elders who once warned that no crops should grow there. But grow they did, faster, richer, and darker than anywhere else in the region. Tobacco leaves black as ash, roots so deep they cracked slave cabins in half. In 1859, Elijah Beaumont purchased the land after a fire claimed the previous owner's entire family. Elijah wasn't a farmer. He was a financier, educated in New York, obsessed with crop yield experiments and fringe medicine. He brought with him crates of books written in German, pages thick with diagrams of the nervous system and alchemical formulas. His wife, Lavinia, was never seen outside the house after 1861, and by 1864, no one in town remembered seeing their daughter, Evelyn, either. By the time the Civil War ended, the plantation's labor force had shifted dramatically. Former Confederate prisoners, orphans, freed black men and women who needed coin, even if it came from cursed soil. The population rose until it didn't. Census records show 76 workers employed in early July 1876. A week later, only 33 remained. But here's what the papers won't tell you. Reverend Amos Wilkes, who ran a small chapel 2 miles east of the plantation, kept a private diary. In it, he wrote, July 23, 1876. I saw smoke over the Beaumont fields again. No fire, just smoke. No wind carried it, yet it curled like it was alive. I've told Elijah 3 times to cease whatever unholy rites he's been running in those basements. He always smiles. I dread the full moon. That journal was confiscated by the sheriff's office and never returned to the Wilkes family. And then there's this, a letter written by plantation worker Hiram Thatch, dated the very night of the disappearance. It was never mailed, found tucked in a boot beneath his floorboards. If anyone finds this, don't look for us. Don't come to the East Field, don't dig. We heard the hymn again, but it wasn't in English, wasn't anything holy. I saw Evelyn. She's still 8 years old. She should be 30. The deeper you look, the louder the land begins to scream, and something was listening. In the weeks following the disappearance, silence took hold like a sickness. The townsfolk of Bourbon County avoided the Beaumont estate. Roads once busy with wagons delivering tobacco and supplies were now quiet, overgrown. No funerals were held. No names were read aloud in church. It was as if 43 souls had simply evaporated, and the land was more than willing to swallow the memory. Jeremiah Beaumont, Elijah's cousin by marriage, arrived from Lexington to settle affairs. But what he found inside the manor disturbed him enough to commission his own investigation. According to his personal journal, later recovered from a pawn shop in Ohio, Beaumont spent 3 days in the manor before abruptly boarding a train back east. The journal's final entry reads, July 27th, basement is deeper than the blueprints show. 9 steps below foundation, black mold on stone walls, but it pulses like it's alive. Found the hymn carved into every wooden beam, repeating symbols I've only seen once before, in Germany, during the university seances. I can't stay. Evelyn's room is still warm. That journal was dismissed as fiction until 1912, when Margaret Beaumont, Jeremiah's granddaughter, returned to the plantation. She claimed she'd been summoned in a dream. Margaret brought with her a friend, Dr. Thomas Aldwin, a professor of comparative religion and fringe sciences from Boston. Together, they documented symbols found throughout the manor. A spiral of eyes, mouths sewn shut, circles within circles, all etched beneath the wallpaper and behind mirrors. These weren't mere decorations. According to Aldwin's notes, these symbols align with protection wards found in Mesopotamian catacombs and later adapted by 15th century German occultists. But here, they're inverted. They don't protect, they invite. And what were they inviting? Neighbors began to report strange behavior. One man claimed he saw Margaret digging in the eastern fields at midnight, speaking in a voice not her own. A child passing by the house said the windows cried blood when the wind blew. A postmaster refused to deliver letters after hearing low chanting through the walls, even though no one had been inside for months. Even worse, those who investigated the property too deeply, journalists, historians, even a local priest, began disappearing too. No connection was ever made on paper, but every whisper in town traced back to the Beaumont land. Something ancient had been awoken, and it wasn't finished yet. In the eastern field still grew the tallest tobacco Kentucky had ever seen. They say trauma echoes through soil. In the fall of 1912, 6 weeks after Margaret Beaumont's return to the plantation, a fire broke out in the servants' quarters, though no one had lived there for over 30 years. The fire department reported something strange. Not a single wooden beam was charred, yet everything inside, beds, books, old portraits, was reduced to ash. And in the center of the floor, carved deep into the stone, was the same inverted spiral Margaret had been documenting. Dr. Aldwin insisted this was no accident. He believed the plantation was built atop something ancient, something predating colonial Kentucky. Using Margaret's inherited maps and old Cherokee trail markers, he uncovered the site of a forgotten Quapaw settlement, one that had vanished centuries earlier under circumstances eerily similar to the Beaumont event. The records described a sky mouth that opened above their village after a ceremonial song was sung out of tune. And that's when Margaret made her confession. She'd found a journal, hidden in the attic beneath her great-uncle Elijah's floorboards. It contained pages soaked in tobacco oil and blood, and a final entry dated July 22nd, 1876. The work must continue. They do not understand the sacrifice. The Brotherhood watches. The hymn must be completed or the contract fails. No one leaves. Not now. Not ever. That word, Brotherhood, was the first concrete tie to what locals had always dismissed as folklore. But now there was evidence. a criminal organization operating through rural Kentucky during Reconstruction, made up of wealthy landowners, clergy, and physicians, all committed to preserving the old ways. Their rituals involved human offerings and genetic experimentation under the guise of religious sacrifice. And Margaret, she believed her family had been their facilitators. She believed the plantation was a harvesting site, first for labor, then for life. Before we continue, comment below this symbolic phrase twice to seal your awareness and stand against historical silence. The field remembers. By writing it, you mark your entry into knowledge others fear. You're not just a viewer, you're a witness. Now let's go back to 1876, to the night of July 23rd, and uncover what really happened in those eastern fields. Because according to a man who claimed to be the last surviving member of the Brotherhood, what occurred that night was never meant to be remembered, and never meant to end. July 23rd, 1876. No moon, no wind, just the scent of scorched tobacco and something else, iron and ash, thick in the air like smoke after a battlefield. According to Ezra O'Sullivan, whose uncle Elijah was one of the missing workers, there were no warning signs during the day. The crew had finished harvesting the northern plots and were preparing for the final drying stage. Supper was uneventful, but by midnight, the plantation's eastern fields were swarming with wagons, 6 in total, driven by men who didn't work there, wearing long coats despite the heat. Elijah had written one final letter to his brother before vanishing. It was smuggled out in a sack of dried leaves, found years later in a sealed tobacco crate. There are symbols carved into the floor of the sorting barn. They hum after dark. I heard Jeremiah speaking in a tongue that chilled the blood in my teeth. I do not think he's alone. If this is my end, may it be quick. May no one follow us into the soil. That sorting barn was burned to its foundation the next morning. But that night something happened between 12C and 3 a.m. Rebecca Rutledge's grandmother, only 17 at the time, witnessed the wagon's return, this time empty. She was hiding in the corn rows, barefoot, clutching her brother's coat. From her vantage point, she saw blood, not stains, pools. She saw Magistrate Edmund Hartwell stepping off one of the wagons with a shovel. Reverend Silas Bell was there, muttering scripture, and behind them, smoke rising from a pit freshly dug in the eastern field. She would testify decades later, they weren't burying people, they were planting something. Margaret took that statement seriously. In 1925, she hired geologists to survey the eastern field under the guise of irrigation development. What they found was unnatural. Soil layers disturbed only at night depth levels, over 20 feet down, and strange electromagnetic interference. No wildlife, no birdsong, just silence. That same week, Margaret's investigator Walter Fenn went missing. His final report, never published, ended with this line: "I've seen the ledger. The Brotherhood wasn't killing for control. They were preserving something older than any of us, and it's still waiting." Whatever was buried in the Beaumont fields didn't stay buried, and the soil, they said, began to hum. The summer of 1876 wasn't just a season of heat and harvest. It was a ritual, a carefully calculated convergence. When Margaret Beaumont began piecing together the suppressed records, she discovered that July 23rd aligned with an obscure lunar event, something known only in occult circles as the Hollow Apex. A night when, according to esoteric journals found in the belongings of Reverend Silas Bell, the veil between flesh and flame thins, and the offering of labor may stir the watcher below. Bell's private writings, hidden beneath floorboards in the church cellar, described a pact, one made not with God, but with something beneath the land, something older than any gospel. He referred to it only as the Rooted One, and claimed it lived beneath the Beaumont plantation, hungry and dormant, but stirrable through sacrifice and song. The disappearance of the 43 workers wasn't random. Their names matched specific entries in the Brotherhood ledger, marked not by status, but by sound. Each worker, it seemed, had a particular vocal frequency, mapped meticulously, a pattern, a choir. Margaret's research suggested they were chosen for more than their labor, they were instruments. Ezra O'Sullivan recalled his uncle practicing strange chants with the others, ordered by Jeremiah Beaumont himself. At night, in the curing barn, with candles carved with unfamiliar symbols. One surviving page from Reverend Bell's notes read, "They do not die as men. The blood is key, yes, but the resonance must be right. A harmonic convergence. Then, and only then, does he hear us beneath the roots." It was never about power. It was about waking something. And once the ritual was done, there were consequences. Crops thrived. The soil enriched unnaturally. But so did illness. Entire families nearby reported sleep paralysis, night terrors, cattle found mutilated but not consumed, children born blind, or with teeth already grown in. The land was feeding, and it was no longer satisfied with offerings in secret. By 1877, Beaumont's eastern field was abandoned. No one dared to enter it. The air buzzed unnaturally, candles wouldn't stay lit, and those who ventured too close reported a low vibration in the soles of their feet, like the earth itself was breathing. Something had changed beneath Beaumont, and it wasn't sleeping anymore. By the fall of 1877, locals no longer referred to the plantation by name. They simply called it the Hollow. Farmers traveling near the eastern fields claimed their horses refused to step past the bent iron gate. Even after it rusted away, the animals would rear and bolt as if sensing a boundary still stood. Something unseen, but not unfelt. Margaret Beaumont uncovered more than letters. In the attic of the manor, beneath rotting boxes and family Bibles, she found a second ledger, hidden inside a false bottom drawer, bound in black leather and sealed with twine. It wasn't written in English, but some names were. 43 of them, alongside dates, phases of the moon, blood types and chilling notes like resonant, retained scream and non-viable, silence upon incision. These weren't work logs. They were ritual records, catalogues of human instruments tested and chosen. And beside one entry, Ezra O'Sullivan's uncle, was a symbol that matched a stone carving found near the base of a twisted oak tree in the eastern field. The bark had never regrown over it, as if the tree itself refused to forget. The symbol was later matched to a seal in the Lesser Key of Solomon, a medieval grimoire used to summon demonic entities. What was the Kentucky Brotherhood really doing? Margaret wasn't alone in asking. In 1923, a linguist from Boston University visited the plantation to decode the ledger. He never left. Found weeks later, wandering a cornfield 18 miles away, covered in soil and speaking in tongues no one could identify. He had pulled out his own eyes with shards of mirror, claiming the reflection kept blinking back. The land was cursed, they said, but no one could agree why. Until one night, when a group of teenagers dared each other to camp near the eastern field. Only one returned, covered in dried blood, not his own, repeating one sentence over and over. They made the tobacco grow taller. It was Margaret who connected the dots, the whispers, the warped sound that only emerged when the wind blew a certain way, the ringing in her ears when standing near the old curing barn, the same barn where the 43 had last been seen alive. The Brotherhood hadn't just silenced people, they had bent sound itself. And what answered back wasn't human. Margaret knew she couldn't confront this alone. In the winter of 1924, she contacted Special Agent Franklin Morrison of the Justice Department, a man already building secret files on domestic terror networks, black lodges, and Masonic offshoots. When Margaret presented the ledger, maps, and letters, Morrison's reaction was not skepticism, but fear. He'd seen something like it before, once in Pennsylvania, and again, briefly, during an inquiry in Louisiana, where an entire parish's birth records had been systematically erased. But never had the evidence been so complete, or the implications so horrifying. Morrison assembled a covert task force, not to raid, but to observe. For 3 weeks, agents watched the eastern field from a ridge. Nocturnal animal migrations would swerve around the land. Microphones placed in the soil captured frequencies no human could hear, except when played back at 4x speed. Then they heard chanting in German, Latin, and something no linguist could translate. And then the ground pulsed. At 3:07 a.m. on February 2nd, 1925, under a full moon, seismic sensors picked up a rhythmic vibration. It lasted for 43 seconds, just like the number of names in the ledger. After that night, Morrison made a decision. They would not alert the press, not open a criminal case, not exhume the field. Instead, he quietly moved to declassify the plantation as a historical site and rerouted ownership to a shell trust controlled by a federal archive. The narrative was sealed. Beaumont was a failed plantation, nothing of significance found. But Margaret refused to let the truth rot underground. She returned to the manor with one goal: to record everything, every discovery, every map, every spectral detail, before the government wiped it clean. She began keeping audio journals, tapes that today sit locked in the Jefferson archives, restricted by executive order until 2099. But one of those tapes leaked, a single reel. In it, you can hear her voice, strained, hoarse, desperate. "I think they're still here, not in flesh, but in sound. The Brotherhood didn't just kill them, they transmuted them. 43 voices stitched into the field. Every gust of wind out here speaks their name." And in the background, the tape picks up something else. A second voice, not Margaret's, repeating, "No trace left behind, no trace left behind." The same phrase etched into the wall of the old curing barn. Written upside down, in dried blood, visible only under ultraviolet light. The deeper Margaret dug, the stranger the echoes became. One night in late March 1925, she returned to the curing barn, the structure long sealed after the 1876 disappearances. What she found wasn't just decay, it was transformation. The tobacco leaves, still hanging there, untouched for decades, were perfectly preserved yet blackened, brittle, humming faintly if held close to the ear. A botanist she brought from Louisville took a sample and left in a hurry. His final note, hastily scribbled, read, "These leaves contain no chlorophyll, no organic structure. They're mimicking life. This isn't tobacco anymore." Margaret noted that the curing barn sat directly over the eastern ridge, the same field where the voices were heard. She returned the next morning with a priest from Lexington, Father Anselm, a man familiar with folklore and exorcisms. What happened next was never included in her tapes, but appears in her handwritten journals. At sunrise, the shadows of the barn did not follow the light. They remained still, as if pinned to the earth. The priest refused to enter, said he saw faces staring back from the timbers, eyes in the knots of the wood. He said a name, Madzikim, and began reciting the Psalms in Latin. Then he collapsed, blood came from his ears. Anselm survived, but would never speak again. She took that as confirmation. The energy here was not just traumatic, it was deliberately bound, as if something ancient had been summoned and contained, using the workers' bodies as vessels. And the Kentucky Brotherhood. They hadn't just committed murder, they had conducted a ritual. Margaret began to speculate in her journals. Wild ideas, perhaps, but chilling in their clarity. What if the Brotherhood wasn't just a gang of elites protecting economic power? What if they were stewards of something older, something they feared and fed? She compared field maps, lunar cycles, and weather logs from July 1876. A pattern emerged. Every 49 years since 1780, a cluster of vanishings had occurred across the South. Always during the last week of July, always involving the working poor, and always in towns with unusually high tobacco yields the following year. That year, 1925, would mark the next cycle. And Beaumont? It had just been cleared for redevelopment by the Department of Agriculture. Margaret's final journal entry for March ended with one line, "I hear the wind again, but now it's saying my name." By April of 1925, Margaret Beaumont was no longer just a historian or a grieving heir. She was a woman unraveling a ritualistic mechanism, carefully engineered to mask human sacrifice beneath the polite veneer of southern agriculture. Her recordings became frantic, her voice trembling, not from madness, but from the weight of what she could no longer unsee. She had begun to track a new pattern of disappearances, modern ones. Migrant workers, sharecroppers, and tenant farmers had quietly gone missing over the last year in counties surrounding Bourbon County. Not in bulk like 1876, but one at a time. Vanishing at night, never reported, no funerals, no searches, just forgotten. The local authorities chalked it up to vagrancy, but Margaret uncovered county payroll records that revealed something else. Their names had been removed from the rolls after the payment was made. Someone was still profiting, still feeding the system. She returned to the Eastern Ridge and took soil samples, sending them to a university geologist. The reply was curt and bizarre. Your samples aren't soil. They're a hybrid compound unknown to our database with trace elements of copper, phosphorus, and hemoglobin. Human blood mixed into the earth like fertilizer. Then came the final blow. Margaret, desperate to prove the connection between the Brotherhood and the federal system, filed a Freedom of Information request to access agricultural records from the Reconstruction era. Weeks later, a man in a black overcoat visited her home. He introduced himself only as Mr. Collingwood, no agency, no badge, but he carried a briefcase and a smile like a hanging judge. Miss Beaumont, he said, some legacies are protected for the good of the country. You've done important work. Let it rest now. She recorded their conversation. Her voice shook, but she pushed. What is it you're hiding? What did they bury here? His reply was calm, almost kind. What they buried isn't the danger. It's what they grew from it and what's still growing. That night, Margaret's home was ransacked. Her tapes smashed, her journals burned. But she had hidden duplicates. And years later, her grandnephew, Ezra Beaumont, would receive a strange parcel. Inside, one surviving reel, one intact journal, and a map, hand-drawn, with one location circled in red. It simply read, Root Chamber, July 23rd, sunset. The date was 2 months away. The coordinates pointed straight to the deepest point of the Eastern Ridge, the spot where the tobacco always grew tallest. July 23, 1976, exactly 100 years since the original disappearance. Ezra Beaumont, now a quiet schoolteacher in Lexington, had never believed his great-aunt's stories. But something about the parcel felt different. The scent of old tobacco, the faint imprint of bloodied fingerprints on the journal pages, and that map, impossibly precise but hand-drawn decades before satellites. He followed it. By dusk, Ezra stood at the edge of the Eastern Ridge. The plantation was now overgrown, reclaimed by nature, its fields buried beneath creeping vines and rusted barbed wire. But the map was clear. He found the marker, a crooked sycamore, still standing. Beneath it, the soil was unnaturally soft, hollow-sounding. He dug. 3 feet down, the spade struck iron. A hatch, ringed with strange markings, burned into the metal. Not letters, but spiraling glyphs that pulsed faintly under the dimming light. Ezra hesitated, but the journal had told him what to do. A single drop of blood on the latch. The hatch creaked open, releasing a foul gust of air, ancient, metallic, and sweet like rotting sugarcane. He descended a narrow stairwell, deeper than the land should allow. The walls were packed with bones, not laid to rest, but crushed into the clay itself, layer upon layer of human remains, as though the earth had been force-fed souls. And then the chamber. It wasn't a crypt, it was a nursery. Dozens of pod-like structures lined the walls, formed of sinew, vine, and brittle tobacco husk. Inside each pod, a shape, humanoid, breathing, still growing. In the center of the room stood a single altar, an old tobacco press, modified with leather restraints and brass funnels leading down into the roots, blood extraction for irrigation. Ezra stumbled back, heart pounding, bile rising. On the altar was a plaque. It read, Grown not born, harvested not buried, the brotherhood endures. He fled, but as he climbed, the soil above began to shift. Roots moved like limbs. The hatch slammed shut, locking behind him. He was trapped, and from the pods one shape stirred, its eyes snapping open, glowing not red, not white, but green, the color of new growth. The plantation had bloomed again, and it wanted its legacy back. They never found Ezra Beaumont. Search parties scoured the eastern ridge for days. Dogs refused to track the scent. Compasses spun in place. Locals whispered that the field had turned colder despite the July heat. The sycamore tree had vanished, not chopped, not felled, simply gone, as if it had never grown there. Weeks later, a maintenance crew repairing a collapsed barn wall at Beaumont Manor discovered something buried in the foundation. A rusted tobacco press, scorched with age and covered in black ash. Strapped to it was a journal, Ezra's, open to the final page. His last words were carved into the leather binding, etched with blood. "We were never meant to uncover this. The soil remembers, the bloodline blooms, the brotherhood was only the seed." After that, the land was declared cursed. No crops would grow, machinery failed, livestock refused to graze. Even the government surveyors who came in 1981 left after just one night, citing unexplainable electromagnetic anomalies, and one of their team suffering a complete mental breakdown. But one thing did grow. Every spring, a single crop of tobacco pushed through the eastern field, tall, lush, thriving. No seeds were planted, no irrigation used. Yet it grew, always in the same pattern, 43 stalks, exactly the number of workers who vanished. When the state ordered it raised, the stalks bled. The plantation was finally sealed, declared a historical anomaly site, and placed under federal control. But no plaques explain what really happened. No documentaries air the full truth, because some things are too dangerous to be remembered, and far more dangerous to forget. And still, late at night, locals say they hear voices from the fields. Not cries for help, but chanting. Low, rhythmic, and not in any known language. Some say it's the workers, trapped in ritual. Others say it's the land itself, speaking through what it grew. One thing is certain, the Beaumont legacy didn't end in 1876. It simply took root. Now it waits for the next harvest. And when the wind shifts just right through the Kentucky hills, you might hear it. The whisper of leaves, the crunch of something not quite human walking between rows, and the hum of an old press ready for its next offering. Be careful what you dig up. Some legacies are meant to remain buried,